TA red and purple lines have no service right now between Howard and Belmont after a mechanical problem on a train near Wilson led to an evacuation of that train, power being cut off. Shuttles are available between Howard and Belmont, but there is only service on the red line between Belmont and 95th. On the inbound Kennedy, there was a pedestrian walking around Damon. That situation's cleared. We're back to 20 minutes, so here to downtown, outbound the same. Inbound Eisenhower, you're looking at a 1 or 2 minute delay between Manheim and 25th Avenue. Inbound Stevenson, traffic's tight Pulaski to Kedzie and Ashland to the Ryan. 30 minutes, 355 to Lakeshore Drive. The Ryan is 20 minutes, 95th to downtown. That's traffic. I'm Chip Talamonte on AM 560, The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next. In our 1 hour heating and air conditioning weather center, clouds and showers developing mid-morning. Could be some heavy stuff by about 11:30 if the National Weather Service is right, and heavier storms could crop up in the afternoon, a high of 81. Heavy storms continuing into the overnight, partly cloudy and humid, and a low of 59. 73 right now. Next news at 8. Breaking news as it happens. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen to AM 560, The Answer, online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, on TuneIn, iHeart, and radio.com. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. And going back to that extensive interview that Attorney General Barr did with Maria Bartiromo in Fox Business, he was asked about what's going on in places like CHAZ / CHOP. It's, whichever you prefer, I suppose, to each his own, although that's a bygone concept, isn't it?
Yes, please.
Barr said this.
Well, in the first instance, it's the responsibility, obviously, of the local officials and then the state officials to protect the rights of their citizens. At the end of the day, the federal government does have a responsibility to make sure that citizens are not deprived of their federal rights.
And on policing generally?
The job of being a policeman in the United States these days is the toughest job in the United States. They're under a lot of pressure, and I was concerned even before these pressures that we were having difficulty maintaining the levels of police we need in our cities, retaining them. And obviously this environment where they're demonized will deter a lot of people from continuing to serve as police. And also, I'm concerned of the effect that they may pull back some of their enforcement activities and not take those risks. So I think it could lead, as it's led in other situations, to an actual increase in violent crime and more deaths.
And Bartiromo also asked him about the case against former Atlanta police officer Rolfe in Atlanta and the Rayshard Brooks shooting. He wouldn't weigh in specifically on this because he may have to weigh in on it at some point, but he did offer some notes of concern in terms of how the Fulton County District Attorney came to level the charges against the two officers.
Well, because I might be called upon as Attorney General to pass judgment on that case under civil rights laws, I don't want to get into the specifics of it, but I certainly would have liked to have seen the Georgia Bureau of Investigations complete their investigation before charges were brought, and also the use of a grand jury. The grand jury process provides some protection to have the citizens in a group decide that there's been a crime committed, and there was no grand jury used in this case. So I think it's important to go through the right processes before charging someone. I also think there was, a fundamental difference, obviously, between what happened in Atlanta and what happened in Minneapolis.
For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, and we'll get to that district in a moment, and contributing editor at National Review, also author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Dan and Amy, good morning.
So let's start with what he said about a federal responsibility for the autonomous zone in Seattle at some point, perhaps. I mean, there was a killing over the weekend in that autonomous zone in which Seattle police were unable to get to the victim apparently the paramedics of the new independent nation brought the two shooting victims to the hospital, where at least one of them passed away. And so what about the idea that the federal government should intervene, or the Trump administration should concede this matter to state and local authorities in Washington State and Seattle?
Well, I think Attorney General Barr was trying to choose his words carefully and also always respect federalism, because I think with him that's a big issue. He's an originalist constitutionally speaking, and the framers' design here was that most of the internal affairs of the state are supposed to be taken care of by the state government. On the other hand, when his mention of federal rights is very broad, because since the 1960s and 70s, the Supreme Court has applied most of the Bill of Rights to the states. And in addition to that, you have all kinds of federal rights. So I think what he was hinting at there is that, we have these civil rights laws which prevent or make it criminal to deprive people of their federal rights. And your federal rights are very, very broad. So I think if the federal government wanted to jump in here and thought they had to jump in here, they'd have more than sufficient legal basis. But out of respect for the federalist structure of our system, they'd like to see the city and state governments take care of it, which doesn't. I don't know what the government is in CHAZ, so I don't know what's going to happen there.
Yeah, but don't people have a right to enter their own businesses? And I mean, they had a problem with picking up garbage, so sanitation workers actually took down that metal barrier, the border that they put up once they took over, put in concrete and then plywood so that they could have poetry jams and that they can graffiti the plywood. But if you're a business owner inside CHAZ or CHOP, what rights do you have, if any?
Well, I guess, from the federal government perspective, they're not as their on the ground police resources are not as good as the state and cities. So, one of the things that you say, Amy, I know this sounds callous, but it is meaningful, is, why do you guys keep electing Democrats to run your cities? Because this is what you get. Mm-hmm. But obviously that's cold comfort to people who are suffering. What the feds usually do is try to figure out if they're going to intervene, a kind of a big sweeping case that they can do that sends the message to people that if the federal government does get deeply involved, that people can get arrested and prosecuted and sent to jail for a long time. But they're not the city police. They're not going to, the FBI is not going to come and let you operate your business. That's not what they do.
You heard Attorney General Barr's careful comments regarding the Rayshard Brooks shooting case and the charges against, particularly the capital charges against Garrett Rolfe. You were less nuanced in your piece in National Review that we actually discussed quite a bit on Friday. I mean, you torched the Fulton County DA. So give us perspective. Are you similarly concerned about the process, like, again, not allowing the investigation to be completed, not using a grand jury to return the charges, or the actual charges themselves, or both?
Well, both. And you're right. I did leave my euphemism dictionary home, thesaurus, I guess, that day. But, yeah, well, look, under the Constitution, they have to go to a grand jury. You can't just file a murder charge. The grand jury protection, I made a little joke about it in the column, which was not otherwise a very funny column, I'll grant you. But the idea that, everybody says a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. And a lot of times that's functionally true, but a grand jury is a good thing in a case like this one, where, a prosecutor, to get an indictment on an allegation like this, is going to have to convince a grand jury that not only that these cops should be charged at all, but that they should be charged with all things capital murder by the way, a prosecutor who said, like, about 5 minutes ago, he was against capital punishment. So I do think this is not going to stand, and I do think that the reason he rushed it was for political reasons. He knows that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation is going to, come to a conclusion that maybe these cops shouldn't even be charged at all. I certainly think, from what I know about the case, that this is not a criminal case. If you want to talk about whether
Really?
they did things wrong, yeah, I don't think it's a criminal case at all. If you want to say they did, they may have made mistakes along the way, I don't know even if that's a fair indictment, given they were assaulted by somebody who was a career violent felon who was actively violating for about the third time that they caught him on the conditions of his release at the time that they confronted him. He assaulted them, stole their taser, and shot it at the head of one of the police officers. So, I don't mean to laugh. I just looking at it as a strict legal problem as opposed to the tragedy that happened. How you could charge the police with using excessive force under the circumstances is beyond me, because they can't let the guy flee. If they let the guy flee and he ends up hurting someone, the cops are in trouble for that. So I just don't see this as a criminal case at all. I see it as a very appropriate matter for the police to investigate it, and if there's some discipline that needs to be exacted, because I understand the Ralph, the main guy, has already been fired, but it seems to me that if they wanted to look at it in order to see whether somebody should be suspended or fired or something, that's perfectly appropriate. But the criminal law is supposed to be for intentional wrongs or recklessness that's so out of bounds that the criminal law has to address it. I don't see any chance of that in this case. I don't think the Georgia Bureau of Investigations will see it, and I don't see how a grand jury would indict it.
Yeah. And what do you think? How important do you think it is that he has a runoff election August 11th? I'm talking about the DA Howard. How do you think that affected his decision?
Oh, I think it's driving every decision he makes. I think it drove the decision, 10 days before, where, he went after those cops for tasing the people at the demonstration. I'm not championing what the cops did here. I'm just pointing out that 10 days before, he noted that a taser is a deadly weapon under Georgia law. And then when Brooks shot the taser toward the head of Ralph, suddenly that was not a big deal, and we were supposed to conclude that Ralph never saw himself as in danger. So what this DA is obviously doing is what you do when you're in a political campaign rather than a rigorous legal exercise, which is he's saying whatever pops into his head that he thinks will be politically expedient to get him more votes than his rival at the next election. And by the way, he's behind in the voting at the moment. He was second in the runoff. The person he's running against, who is in his office, is a well-regarded African-American woman with a lot of law enforcement experience. And he has, if I'm recalling it correctly, 2 sexual harassment complaints from women in his own office, and there's an ethics investigation into him for possible campaign finance violations. So he's got to do whatever he can to turn the page and change the story.
Doesn't Rolf, though, still have the problem of the shooting of Rayshard Brooks in the back? He's fleeing, and he's shot in the back. And as Fulton County DA said, shooting somebody in the back is against police procedure. And if it's against police procedure and it results in the death of someone, that certainly opens up a criminal avenue, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, there's a difference, Dan, respectfully, between shooting someone in the back, as in aiming to shoot at somebody in the back who is fleeing and has given up all resistance, and the shooting that happened in this circumstance, which I looked very carefully at the tape. Mm-hmm. At the time that he shoots, Brooks is running forward, but he has the right part of his torso turned backwards toward Rolf, where he's still pointing the taser at him. So under those circumstances where they were both running, Rolf shot him, but it's not like he was aiming to shoot him in the back, and it's not like he was going after a guy who wasn't resisting and wasn't being an aggressive threat. This was a fleeing felon who was in possession of a weapon. So it's not really when they talk about you're not supposed to shoot somebody in the back, What they mean is, guy's 50 yards away, he's unarmed, and he's
the Walter Scott
trying
case.
to hook it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. This is not that. This is the guy was turned around pointing a weapon at the police officer as he discharged, and he happens to have hit him in the back, but that's because of the offensive posture that the guy, who was fleeing was in.
Before we let you go, I want to get your reaction to the termination of U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman of the Southern District of New York, where you spent 2 decades. Every Trump personnel matter becomes a melodrama. This seems to be another such instance.
Yeah, this is like a total mountain out of a molehill, I think. Maybe timing-wise, the Attorney General and the Justice Department could have handled this better, but I actually think they got double-crossed here in the sense that, look, Berman, who is the U.S. Attorney, was never confirmed. So he's an interim U.S. Attorney. He was never nominated by the President. It's not like he's a full-fledged U.S. Attorney. They have another guy who they like, Jay Clayton, who's the head of the SEC. He's ready to leave the government, but he says he'll stick around if they make him U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, which is, who wouldn't want to be that if you're in the government? That's, launched Rudy Giuliani's career. It's a very plum perch in the government. So
yeah, but he's never
they want to
prosecuted
keep Clayton.
a case. Is he never? Isn't that true? He's never.
Amy, I'm not saying I would have picked him. I'm saying saying that this is the job he wanted, and they like him, right?
Okay.
And yes, he's never prosecuted a case, but he's got a lot of Wall Street experience, and that's a big part of the gig at the Southern District. I would prefer to see someone with SDNY experience, but I'm a snob that way. And what happened was, so Barr goes up to see Berman when he's in New York on Friday, and he basically says to him, look, you're out. We're trying to put Clayton in, but we don't want to lose you. Would you like to be chief of the criminal division in the Justice Department? Would you like to be in the SEC? So they were talking about what was going to happen next, but it was made clear to Berman that he was out. And then Barr tries to call Berman. Berman doesn't answer his calls. I imagine Barr didn't like that too much. So he put the statement out. And Berman then acted like, I had no idea they wanted to get rid of me.
Yeah.
When he knew very well they wanted to get rid of him. And then he puts out this ridiculous statement that, the Southern District of New York is the most storied prosecutor's office in the United States. It's done the biggest cases in the country. And Jeff Berman, the interim U.S. attorney, comes out and says, I can't leave until there's a permanent replacement because we need to protect the integrity of our investigations, as if he, Jeff Berman, is necessary to have there at the brink in case otherwise the Southern District's investigations will be corrupted, which is about, for anyone who worked at the Southern District for 5 minutes, that's the most preposterous, arrogant statement that's perhaps ever been made. I don't blame Barr and the president for kicking him to the curb the next day. But they weren't trying to kick him to the curb. They were looking to give him another job.
He's like Eminem. It would be so empty without him at the Southern District of New York. Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney, contributing editor at National Review, author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. If you haven't picked it up yet, do so. Andy, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.